Imagine living in a world where your memories start to fade, your thoughts become foggy, and you're the only one navigating this new reality. For millions of women over the age of 65, this is their daily experience. In fact, over 40% of women 75 and older live alone, facing the challenges of aging without a partner. So, how can we care for ourselves cognitively as we age? And what happens when we're solo agers and we're experiencing some form of cognitive decline? These are the questions millions of women are asking themselves every day, and hopefully, this episode will answer some of them. Welcome back, Fading Memories listeners. You know, I absolutely love that you've spent an hour with me every week. I have a really fantastic topic that in over 7.5 years I have not talked about, and that is living alone with dementia. So with me today is Michael Splain. He is the owner and principal in Splain Consulting. What they do is they're a small advocacy and government affairs consulting firm based in Washington, D.C. And right before starting that company, he was also the director of the State Government Affairs in the Public Policy Division of the U.S. Alzheimer's Association, something you guys know that I am a big part of. And then he was there for 23 years, during which he and his business partner, Kate Gordon, were the architects of the state Alzheimer's disease plan strategy that started in 2007. So I knew my mom had Alzheimer's at that point. Well, I knew she had dementia. She wasn't formally diagnosed by that point, but it's been a ways back. And he's also the managing partner of a related company, Recruitment Partners LLC, which is focused on improving the pace, quality, and diversity of recruitment into dementia clinical trials, which we know is so desperately needed. So thanks for joining me today, Mike. I hope I didn't butcher that too badly.
Oh, you got everything but dad, grandpa, and husband of 47 years to the same woman, but
You didn't
important
write that
stuff
in
in my
the.
light. I didn't write that in what I sent you. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I didn't butcher it because I can read. So,
It's good.
so how did you get involved in all of this stuff, Mike?
Oh boy. Well, all of this stuff,
All the
it,
Alzheimer's stuff. Let's start there.
my first work with people with serious thinking difficulties actually goes back to, don't laugh, 1973. I got recruited to be uh, a a volunteer teacher. Um, you're not going to hear all of the story, but I'll just tell enough to give you the flavor. I was a Catholic seminarian and a new head of the office for the handicapped, and I don't apologize for the language. That's the language of the time. Was deeply offended that religious instruction and the sacraments were not available to young people with intellectual disability. What we said mental retardation in those days. So Father Sabarin literally wrote a program for special religious ed, taught us all about what it meant to work with people with intellectual difficulties, ran that program off on a mimeograph machine, and set us out in about a dozen parish halls to do that teaching. And that was my first work with people with serious intellectual disability. Um, so it's part of the one of my high school teachers said that my life was not going to be linear, but that I'd have themes. And I will tell you, one of the great themes of my life is working with people with neurocognitive difficulties or thinking problems. So, but in terms of Alzheimer's, I was very fortunate, got a gerontology degree in the early 80s, and came back to Massachusetts from graduate school, and there was an opportunity to invent an Alzheimer respite program, an in-home respite program in 1986. And I fell into working at Alzheimer's by running that program. My mentor, and I had the greatest of mentors. I had at least two people that were part of the founding of the Alzheimer's Association as mentors. All the people that did all the early work on Down syndrome and its connection to Alzheimer's disease were among my mentors, as well as people that were in the very beginnings of developing adult day centers and skilled nursing facilities specific to people with dementia. So I just fell in, went to work at the national office in 1991 after. So I ran the respite program, went to work for the chapter, and went to work at the national level in 1991. So, it just one thing led to another. But I think the themes are advocacy. The themes are uh, also innovation. I mean, and we'll talk more about live alones, but part of the reason I'm so interested in our company, so involved with live alones, is it's not the same old, same old. It's a different Alzheimer's story than yours. It's a different story than many of the people that are listening to this. It's a different story that needs to get told because it's going to be the growing story of living with dementia in the coming years.
That's a perfect segue because before we went to record, I looked up the statistics of people living alone, and I only found strong numbers for women. So we're just going to hear those. So 27% of women 65 and older live alone. And when you get to 75, it's 43%. 43% is a big number,
Yep.
especially since we know that cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's disease affects women disproportionately. That's actually, those two numbers are scary to together, but it's obviously going to become, like you said, a bigger story. So that's why I'm kind of excited to talk about it today. So
Yeah,
how did you get?
I think the stats are part of the story. I mean, there are so 1 in 9 over 65 have some form of Alzheimer's or some form of related disorder. So do the math. I mean, on the numbers you just presented, I think the numbers are part of the story. For two census cycles now, 2020 as well as 2010, an older adult living alone is the fastest growing type of household in America.
That's
That's that's saying
interesting.
something.
Yeah,
That
it
is
is.
interesting.
Well, I'm
So I
thinking
think,
is that because you go backwards 20, 40 years, you have
well,
more divorce?
40% divorce rate among baby boomers. Um, people, a society that gives permission to say, uh, I'm sorry, but to say after the kids are raised and responsibilities that you took on together are satisfied, the hell with you. I'm, I mean, I think that's a real thing. There are a number of people that have been single their whole lives. It's a much more acceptable, for lack of, I put that in air quotes, but a more acceptable way to live than before, I think. But there are also subpopulations. A lot of the older adults who are living alone are LGBT, identify as LGBTQ. And uh, and for a variety of reasons, the AIDS epidemic, a lack of recognition of them being able to have partners or be married. A lot of so that's another subgroup of this group of aging live alones that is actually in some communities actually getting addressed. So it's a lot. It's a big trend.
So it sounds like a trend that might top out at some point and not just keep increasing as the population aging keeps
Well, I think
increasing.
people want to find. I suspect that I know that people are finding new ways to. Let me back up. I think we're built to be part of community, and we're built to be part of small community. That's just, I think, how humans are constructed. And whether it's your tribe or your church or your family, we're built with that kind, we're kind of wired to that in. There's a wonderful resource that we tell people about. There's a shared housing movement, for example, that is providing people, they're out of Vermont, and they provide people the practical tools to build new households of people who previously might have been living alone. interview sheets. How do you do the finances? Just a lot of how-to stuff. I knew this was going someplace when about 6 years ago, Money Magazine, which no longer publishes as an actual magazine, did an article about five retired teachers who were sitting around complaining one day that they lived in a cold state and they wanted to go to Florida for the winter. Reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but between them, they had five houses. And next thing you know, somebody had a bright idea and they said, we could sell two, live together in a third, and own a place in Florida for what we're all paying to. I mean, shared housing spontaneously. When I saw Money Magazine cover that, I knew this was something that was starting to go mainstream, that people are finding new ways to build new kinds of households and communities, small communities. So it's interesting.
I always recommend that caregivers think about when their immediate caregiving is over, like for me, and I don't quite fit into this category, but to consider having a roommate of an older, I generally recommend older ladies, but that's just because I'm always talking to women in this scenario, and it solves a couple of problems. You've got a purpose still. They've got a little more security. And, coming from California where housing is plentiful and cheap, I'm sorry, excuse me, that's sarcasm. It only makes sense to me is to, if the kids are gone, one spouse is gone for whatever reason, I would prefer having like one specific roommate, I think. Been a little while since I've had a roommate that's not the spouse. And that was way back in college. So,
Yeah,
um,
but I think you add to that home modification. So
mm-hmm.
that adapting your home, I have to tell you, we have a set. My wife and we play bridge with the same people for years. We go to the same church. So, you have a cohort, you have your group of friends. And we recently started adapting our house and our biggest project to date was to move the laundry to the second floor. And our set thinks we're nuts. It's like, knock, knock. I'm 70, my wife's 71. I'm not going to move. I'm not going to be one of those guys who are going to go fish in Florida and be a a snowbird. And we've started adapting our house to when we might be frailer. And it's a lot nicer than hauling 60 pounds of laundry up and down to the basement every week. So anyway, my point, but I think you add home modification going mainstream, you can't but watch 10 minutes of television some nights and not see an ad for either a staircase or an elevator. This has gone mainstream. So you put those trends together. I think you're right. I think people, as they look for community, are going to start doing some of that creative stuff. There's always early adopters. So you want to know how we started with live alones with
Mm-hmm.
Alzheimer's.
Yep. I mean, we're at 300 plus, 350 plus recordings, and this is the first time we're talking about this. So, yes, I'm very interested how you got started with this group.
So I'll tell the get started story and then I'll tell some other stories. Um, Simply put, when I worked at the policy office for the Alzheimer's Association, we one of our activities was to work directly with administration for community living, administration on aging, which has made a series of Alzheimer's disease demonstration grants since 1993. It wasn't always the administration on aging. Um, they were trying to discern, they've always targeted this money at hard to reach populations. And they were at a point about 10 years ago that they were going through their regular, what's the hard to reach populations? And we provided our advocacy and our informed opinion. A wonderful lady named Katie Maslow, who's one of the great policy writers and thinkers of Alzheimer's since the mid 1980s. Katie worked directly with the Administration on Aging, and we persuaded them that there were three populations that didn't get any attention: live-alones with Alzheimer's disease, persons with intellectual disability who are either getting dementia or at risk of dementia, and then family caregivers that were dealing with behavioral manifestations in the home, behavioral manifestations of the disease in home. So for about 10 years now, that Administration on Aging program that makes about 15 grant million dollar 3-year grants a year to build dementia capability has had a focus on live alones. So that's part of, and so we grew our expertise on what are people doing programmatically, what are people thinking about, what can we bring to the table, and started making sure that anybody writing any of these ADPI grants, Alzheimer's Disease Program Initiative grants, or that were implementing them, knew that we were available. And we've got some unique things that we do. For example, in November, for one of our ADPI clients, we'll be conducting a community summit on live alones with dementia in Honolulu, and with people joining in from three other islands by Zoom. Kind of miraculous way to do a community summit compared to only face-to-face meetings. We also support an online community of people living alone with dementia. It's called Living Alone and Connected. It's a Facebook group that's private and moderated and provides both social and educational opportunities for people that identify as living alone with dementia. It has some simple ground rules, and I have to tell you, we've only had to block one fake. I don't. In 4 years, we've been sponsoring that community. There's a parallel page that is now up and running that's focused on providing useful information like the shared housing movement information to people that are supporters and allies of people living alone with dementia. So we that's kind of the package that we bring to the table. But when we work with our clients, we have a couple of barriers we have to get over. Uh, when you do a community summit, I'll have to tell you a story. So we're doing a community summit in St. Louis, Missouri. This is pre-COVID. COVID really crushed some of this work. We're finally coming back. So we're in St. Louis, and we're doing about a 70-person community summit on live alones. And as we start all of our work to center it on the people living the reality, we started with a talk by a woman living alone with dementia from a nearby community to St. Louis. And I'm in the back of the room enjoying the talk, and a young gentleman comes up to me and he says, "Are you in charge here?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, I need to know everything you know about her. I need her address, how did she get here, her phone number. It's not possible for a person with Alzheimer's to live alone. And I'm the local Adult Protective Services director, and I'm going to open a case."
Oh, Lord.
And as I do frequently with people half my age that are little pissants, I just kind of looked at them and said, why don't you just hang out and listen? He said, "No, I could arrest you." And I was like, "Okay, been there, done that.
Oh,
Fine."
jeez.
Not afraid. I said, "But really, why don't you just listen and open your heart and open your mind?" And I somehow that caught his attention. Well, the rest of the story is at 2 o'clock, his boss arrives, and he runs up to his boss and says, "You can't believe this has been the greatest day of learning for me ever." And the day started with this lady from so and so lady who was talking about living alone with dementia and how she's organized her life and her support system and in a way that she can live successfully alone, even though she's got major thinking problems. So supervisor says, "Did you open a case?
Oh,
Who's in
Lord.
charge here?" So I'm not painting all adult protective services with the same brush, but it's all this to say, when you say living alone with Alzheimer's disease, the first reaction you get is not possible. It's like what we used to say about the bumblebee, right? Before they finally figured out that how they really fly. We used to say that aerodynamically the bumblebee shouldn't fly ever, and yet it does. And I would say the same thing about people living alone with dementia. Do they all have super successful lives? No. Are they all abjectly unbefriended? No. Are there some that are kind of some in between? Sure. Are they at risk, particularly with their thinking problems and their executive function, making them vulnerable to financial exploitation of all kinds and fraud schemes of all kinds? Absolutely. But there's dignity in letting people take risk too.
That is true. So, how do we help people who are solo agers and live alone with dementia?
Yeah.
You segued very nicely into that.
Well, I think so. I think uh, the successful live alones that we've met uh, build some kind of upon getting a diagnosis or even getting a suspicion that their thinking is starting to change, they begin to build their structure for successful aging. We work with a group called Atlas of Caregiving, and all these things I'm mentioning, I'll make sure you get the websites so that you can post that with the podcast. But Atlas of Caregiving is a nonprofit organization that helps people build care maps. The interesting thing about the care maps is it's about who cares for me or who could care for me and who do I care for. It brings us a sense of reciprocity that caregiving is not all one direction. And so we use Atlas of Caregiving and we recommend people use their care. They're simple to use. They're crazy. I mean, I'm no artist, but these crazy charting of who do I care for and who cares for me as a way of mapping out their future. I think how else do we help people? I think we help them get practical. Who is going to be if you go to the hospital, who's going to feed the cat? I mean, that's that. I mean, it's at that level, but it's more important that if you go to the hospital, who's holding your advanced directives? Who is going to help medical decision makers make decisions for you if you're not able to make them for yourself? So I think but I also believe that anybody above the age of 21 should have advanced care directives on record, and they should actually be in public record. But that's another day's argument.
That's a
So
whole
I
other
think
episode.
that's right. But I think, helping people with the practicals. I, build community. We've learned what social isolation and loneliness, the toll that social isolation and loneliness can take on us as a society and as individuals. In fact, the Surgeon General, likens the impact of social isolation to the equivalent of smoking 2 packs of cigarettes, 15 cigarettes a day, on our overall public health for everybody that's socially isolated. I'm not sure he's got it completely right, but there's a real impact there. So building community, and an example of that is if I'm a member of a local Catholic community, and we have recently had to come to terms with the fact that we are aging rapidly, and there's not a bench. Our kids and our grandkids are not necessarily following in our footsteps the same way we did for our first generation or immigrant parents and grandparents. They're just not automatically picking it up. But the other part of that reflection in our community is that we let people, community should be a verb,
Hmm.
was the insight that we came up with. And the understanding that many of our socially isolated older members, because they couldn't drive, because they didn't want to drive on an icy day. We live in Maryland, which is the ice belt. We don't get
Oh,
real snow. We get this crap that you can't drive in. It's just miserable. But it's just a real understanding that um, what can we do in terms of how we, as a church, how we approach our aging and our solo agers a little bit differently as a and approach it as a community, building community exercise, as opposed to, well, they just can't get here. They can watch mass on the television. Well, that's not. I mean, yeah, but that's not community. So I
that's
think those
true.
are some things that we can do. Raise awareness, and certainly, I suppose part of the overall awareness that needs to be raised is that it is valuable to get diagnosed, not
Definitely.
not because then you have a starting place for planning. If if you continue to buy into we all become senile, mentally challenged before we pass, and you just buy into that and say, oh, there's no great treatments. Why should I get diagnosed? My mother had Alzheimer's. I know it's Alzheimer's. We've heard it all. I mean, John,
Mm-hmm.
you and I have heard of all of those. And I think we're still fighting the good fight to persuade people because you know what? Sometimes it's not Alzheimer's disease.
That's true.
Sometimes it's meds that are in conflict. Sometimes it's other systemic illness. The Alzheimer's disease research centers, the federally funded Alzheimer's disease research centers, which are at the pinnacle of providing medical care as well as research into Alzheimer's disease, tell us that 15% of the time somebody comes to them for diagnosis, they don't have Alzheimer's or a closely related disorder.
15%. That's a
15%. That's
that,
1 in 6.
that's a reasonably hopeful number.
Well, it's a reasonably hopeful number. And if you're part of the 5 out of 6, at least you know what you're dealing with.
True. I know a lot of people, younger people like myself that are, or even younger, who have had some family history like I do of the disease. They're like, they kind of, they don't want to know now because they want to live life in the moment to the fullest, which I get. I'm on the fence, but I'm also getting older than some of these people. So it's like I live every day to do everything I can to take care of my brain. And we'll see if I start having issues, then my attitude might change. But right now, doing good mentally. But I was going to ask the question. So you said there was ways of like structuring their environment to help them live alone with dementia. And I think since that is probably not the majority of my audience, I think if you could explain some of those processes generally, I think those would be beneficial for people who have a family member in the earlier or the middle stages because the longer we can keep them independent and feeling purposeful, the better it is for them, but the better it is for those of us, as you're well aware, we're not, it's very typical for a spouse or the adult child to like want to jump in and fix everything and take care of everything because that's just kind of how we're wired, but it's not necessarily the best choice. So how do they structure some of their environment and their days to you know, get through every day. Remember to feed the cat twice, not 5 times. My mom overfed her dog all the time. What other daily things are there we got to do? Just there's amazing a number of little things that we have to take care of, like water the flowers on the outside table and walk the dog. I'm trying to think of all those little things that you don't think about. But you can fill me in. I don't want to
So
belabor my
I
thought
think there's three or
process.
four. Yeah, there's 3 or 4 things here. One is it's becoming increasingly clear that even if people have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease or multi-infarct dementia, from small strokes, if they take the action steps that are recommended for reducing risk of dementia, they will have a healthier life with dementia. The evidence is stacking up.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one part of what could you change. Sticky notes are completely they're we did a long time ago, we did a project on does the Americans with Disability, I'm sorry, the Americans with Disabilities Act give people with dementia a right to keep a job. And
Mm.
there's two parts to the discrimination based on disability. One is you have a right, but your employer also has to has to be challenged to make an accommodation, and there has to be an accommodation that works. We went to other memory groups. We went to Parkinson's, we went to the Paralyzed Veterans, the Brain Injury Association, and we said, what are you recommending for people that are still working for a help because they have thinking problems and memory problems? And to a man, it was three men, sorry, but to a man, they all said, oh, we tell people to use sticky notes. Now, the upgrade on sticky notes, we have one of our presentations that we do regularly for our online group, our Living Alone and Connected private group, is by an OT, an occupational therapist, who talks about and who has a wonderful presentation on how to organize your house better when you have thinking problems. And so for example, she takes the fact that there is clutter everywhere and essentially recommends you need an office. You need to put your mail in an office. You need a recreation area. You need a place to eat. You need a place because what happens when people's thinking gets sloppy is their homes get sloppy and people start to assume the worst. And, you know, the kid comes in to visit for the first time in 6 months and sees what they think is a hoarder's house because it's completely disorganized and they freak out and they start talking about putting mom in a nursing home. I mean, it happens. So I think there are ways to Sue talks about these ways to structure the physical environment as well as as well as some of those other safety issues. I think increasingly we're seeing technology play a role here. A lot of families tell us that they're using Alexa or the equivalent as with consent as a way of staying in touch or having the solo ager be able to easily be in touch with resources should they need it. One of our clients right now, where as part of their home modification program, they're now assessing this is a community-based organization that serves older people in their community. And they're now adding to their intake and assessment whether or not people have internet and whether they have the capability of using Alexa or from Amazon or another service like that. They're assessing whether or not they have internet because it's become almost an essential for our healthcare to be able to use internet.
That
So
is
this is
true.
part of their ingoing assessment, and we are trying to launch a program where, as an automatic part of all home modifications that this agency is going to do, they're going to install a router if there isn't one, give people resources about getting free or low cost internet access and setting them up with either with one of those Alexa type devices as a safety as well as a risk reduction strategy.
I have a recommendation for, quote, an Alexa on steroids. It's called a Wellbe, so it's WELLBE, just like it sounds. And it does everything an Alexa does, but it also can help carry on conversations,
Yeah.
and I'm sure that's just getting better with AI getting better. And so it does all the Alexa things, the reminders. I guess it doesn't order stuff directly from Amazon, but I don't have an Alexa. I'm an Apple household, so
Well,
we haven't gone down that path yet.
yeah,
But yeah, it's supposed to be a really awesome, like I said, it's like an Alexa on steroids. So
yeah,
if I remember, I
but
will put the link to them in the show notes.
I think about, so my wife and I ended up, for 2 years, we ended up being the primary caregiver for my dad's sister, Betty. Betty was a remarkable woman, single her whole life. Although, as I learned when I got old enough, many times well boyfriended. Um, anyway, I had to be old enough to hear those stories, though. 50 was the beginning age of hearing those stories. So Betty had been in the Coast Guard in World War II.